Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast Aftersight. I am your host, Penn Street, and I hope everybody has had an amazing week. I did want to remind everybody about our upcoming Bringing Print to Life hike. This year, it is Sunday, August 28th in Estes Park, Colorado. And as usual, just like last year, if you are print impaired, the hike is absolutely free. It includes breakfast, lunch. It includes all the support on the hike, sighted guide, all of that fun stuff. And for those who were on the hike last year, this hike is much easier this year, so you don't need to hesitate to sign up. It's only 3 miles round trip. It's at the YMCA of the Rockies in Estes Park, Colorado. It's going to be a beautiful hike, but it's only 700 feet elevation gain. And just like last year, we will be joining people who are in wheelchairs, who are deaf and hard of hearing, people who have had their legs amputated, whatever. We all have barriers, right? So we're all going to do this together. It is a fundraiser. So if you want to sponsor a hiker or get more involved in our fundraising stream, please get a hold of me. And it's real easy to register. You just go to our website, AINColorado.org, and click on hike. And thank you for those people who've already registered. It's going to be a fun time. So we hope to see you up there on the mountain. Now, when we come back, I'm going to introduce you to some pretty amazing guests today, Sabrina and Jody, and we will be right back.
You're listening to Aftersight with Penn Street, an AINC original podcast. If you enjoy what you hear, please visit AINColorado.org for more shows, news, and articles read by our amazing staff and volunteers. If you have a question for Penn or would like to recommend a guest for future shows, please visit AINColorado.org/podcast-guest. And now, here's your host, Penn Street.
Sabrina, going along with what you said in particular, when do you make the call? When, and I know maybe it's different for everybody, but what are some of the signs? Like you said, there was that sheet that your friend, brought home from getting her restraining order, and you looked at it and you realized, oh my gosh, I can check 7 of those boxes.
Yeah. Ironically, a lot of times some of those are things that when you're a young person, you're like, oh, this is wonderful, right? So for example, isolating you from friends and family, but they don't do it like, hey, you're not going to talk to your friends and family anymore. It's much more subtle in general. And they make you feel like, oh, well, you're just you're so important to me that I can't live without you. I can't be without you. I must know what you're doing every second of the day. And when you're in kind of love and they're like, oh, this is wonderful, but it's not wonderful. You don't want somebody controlling every moment of your day, right? It's like, so that's a real big one. That happens a lot, especially with young people. As far as like at work, to identify someone at work that may potentially be suffering from abuse, things like a lot of absences or unusual having to leave early, come in late, avoiding taking calls or getting excessive calls, wearing a turtleneck in the middle of the summer, things like that, or actually seeing bruises and things like that. And then as far as a perpetrator, it's a little bit harder to kind of identify that, but they tend not to take criticism very well. So if, you're a manager and you give them any kind of feedback and they're very, they don't take it well. They may be talking about, for example, the case that I was familiar with, he was actually saying, I can't live without her. I want to kill myself. Right. He never said he was going to kill her, but just him saying, I can't live without her was enough for somebody to intervene. Right. And how do you intervene? Well, you always want to be safe. Your safety is of the utmost importance. Right. So that's why the crisis line is someplace that you can call and just ask, hey, I haven't, my neighbors are fighting all the time. What can I do? Or, I'm worried about my coworker. I'm worried about my friend, or my family member. And they can, the advocate that answers that phone will be able to, kind of give you some advice on how to deal with that. Because a lot of times, like, our tendencies are to be like, oh, he's, and I'm using a guy as an example, but I just want to say, men and women can both be abusers and abused, right? But,
that's for sure.
It can happen, but,
And I think it's like we're looking at, the kind of the power and control of in a relationship. So, I mean, there's people people who have arguments, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's domestic violence. But, if there's this, if one person is exerting power and control over another person, and using that in a way to emotionally, psychologically, physically, financially, spiritually, there's all kinds of ways that a person kind of uses that coercive power and control to have power in that relationship. So we're really kind of looking at that's kind of the niche that we have in terms of who we serve. But also, I mean, there are resources, and like you mentioned, we'll talk about this, give all of our contact information. But on our website, we do have some information. We have a DV 101 book that's available on there, and there's actually a whole assessment in there to say, am I in an abusive relationship, and where people can kind of do that self-assessment to say, oh wow. And I think sometimes what we see is, because it's sometimes so subtle, and it's not just like, the person is a person can be very manipulative, and it kind of builds up, and people sometimes don't even recognize that it's maybe not healthy. And particularly if they've come from generational situations where there was abuse in their home growing up, it's not, that is precursor to people either using those behaviors or getting involved in relationships where there is abuse, because that's what a person recognizes and what they've grown up with. And so trying to help people understand that the abuse that they have experienced is not their fault. It's not their fault. And so just trying to provide that counseling and reassurance that they're and we're also not telling people that they have to leave a relationship, but what we talk about is how do they safely stay in that relationship, and can they recognize the signs that might, when things might be starting to escalate, and how do they kind of navigate that and keep themselves and or their family safe. And so it's a super complex issue, and there's not a one size fits all for everybody. And that's why I said it's very survivor driven in terms of what is it that they're wanting to see, happen. And, then how do we support them in that journey?
Absolutely.
So is that something that somebody could call the crisis line asking those questions? Like, I don't, this doesn't quite feel right, but it's not, it hasn't hit like a violence place yet. Mm-hmm. Is that someplace, is that something that somebody could call the crisis line and talk to somebody about?
Yeah. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because, just have to make the point, that obviously domestic violence isn't just, broken arms and bruises, right? So you could have a survivor that reaches out for our services that has never been hit. Right. So there's so many other forms of abuse. But I always say, because, a big part of it is the emotional abuse. And, and telling the person they're stupid and nobody cares about them and all of this. And for that person to be able to pick up that line and call our crisis center and get help, I always say they were just so brave. And it fills my heart with joy that they found that power to pick up that phone and ask for help. So.
All of our services are confidential. So if a person does reach out to our 24-hour crisis line, that conversation is confidential. The only exception to that would be is if a person has children and they disclose child abuse, we are mandated reporters to report child abuse. If the person who's answering the crisis line is a therapist, they are also mandated to report elder abuse and or harm to self or others. So, but most of the time our crisis line is those are being answered by advocates who don't have that mandate to report harm to self or others or elder abuse. So it's a little confusing sometimes, but but otherwise, like we're not calling law enforcement. I think sometimes people think like, well, if somebody discloses that their partner has been physically violent, that we're going to call law enforcement and report that to law enforcement. That is not the case. And oftentimes, a lot of the people that reach out to service have never contacted law enforcement. They, there may be history where they don't have a lot of confidence in law enforcement, or kind of like you talked about earlier, where people might be discredited or not believed because, if you can't explain what the person who's hurting you looks like, that they're discredited, and that's unfortunate. And that happens, for people who, not just persons with disabilities. A lot of times it happens for a lot of survivors where their story is not believed. And so we believe people when they call us. We're not here to, and yes, sometimes we have had people who maybe are the person who's using those abusive behaviors call us for services because they're trying to manipulate a system too. But we figure that out pretty quickly. And are able to kind of say, like, we're not the best fit for you. But all the confidentiality piece, I think, is key in all of our services, is that, we can't disclose who is working with us. That includes law enforcement. If law enforcement calls us and says, we have reason to believe this person is in your shelter, or, we will not say anything to law enforcement unless we have a release of information to do that. Like the only exception is we're all mandated to report child abuse.
What if somebody's under 18 and they call? Is that a different situation?
So anybody can call the crisis line, and we can't unfortunately take minors into our shelter program without an accompanying parent. So if it's a person who's maybe it's a teen dating violence type of situation, they can engage in our therapy services. And Colorado law require, the age now where people can consent to services without parent approval is 12 and older. However, most 12-year-olds can't get themselves to therapy services. So, we often will have a conversation with a teen to say, like, how, or a preteen, like, how, and there's requirements in terms of what you're going to share and, what a therapist is going to share with a parent anyhow. And so they follow all the, guidelines of ethical practices there. But, so people can engage in those services. I think one of the things that, now that we're seeing, and, we were actually in the process of doing teletherapy and teleservices. We were researching that option to serve people in more rural communities prior to the pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic happened and everybody had to go virtually. So we are actually seeing people continue to prefer teleservices because it, kind of reduces some of those barriers. And I think this is important for persons with disabilities, is that,
Absolutely.
like you said, you can't just pick up and leave. And so maybe there is an option to engage in therapy services virtually through teleservices, and and as long as it's safe to do that, and we talk about safety and making sure partners aren't monitoring internet use and all of that kind of stuff, and how can they safely engage. But I think that has opened up, has decreased some barriers for people in accessing services, because they don't necessarily have to drive to an appointment, and they don't have to leave a job to go to therapy or an advocacy appointment. So I think having the services available virtually has been very helpful for people.
Absolutely. It is a game changer for people with disabilities that virtual now it's a norm. So
it's the norm. And I don't think it's going to go back.
Yeah.
I don't
think so.
I don't think it's, no, I mean, I think there is some talk, particularly with therapy that, some requirements that they're looking at is to say like that the therapist maybe need to meet with that person in person at least every 6 months. But I think there's some discussion happening around that, but I don't know if that's come to fruition or not. But I think, obviously there's things you can't pick up on, nuances you can't pick up on virtually, whereas if somebody's face to face, you can kind of see, body language and things like that. But, particularly for therapy, I think it's a little different for advocacy.
Well, how do people, what is the number people can call? What's the best way to get a hold of you guys?
Yeah, so our crisis line number is 303-688-8484. And then if you want to check out our website, which will soon be all accessible to everyone, it's www.thecrisiscenter.org.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
And we do have a toll-free number too. So that is for the crisis line, it is 888-247-7472.
Great. And like I said, all of those phone numbers and that website will be in the show notes. So you can definitely click directly on those. So, or if you have any questions, you can always call Audio Information Network of Colorado if you're not feeling like that's accessible. We have those numbers in our notes as well that we can share. So that's wonderful. Do either of you want to share a success story that you feel like that has really touched your heart? And I know it'll be anonymous, but that you could share.
Success looks whatever that person thinks it looks like, for them. And it can be so different for everyone, but I think for me, just seeing people get their confidence back. And, sometimes I've worked with individuals that have been so downgraded, particularly moms with kids, like their parenting skills have been so downgraded by their partner. Like they're awful mother, they're this, they're that, they can't keep anything under control, blah, 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 whatever words they might be spewing at them. And to really see moms who are, and imagine trying to leave a situation and you're now the sole parent and having to kind of try to navigate particularly smaller children is a challenge. And so, that's, a barrier of why people often stay too, is because parenting as a single parent is really hard. And so I think just, recognizing when people are doing good things and saying you're a great mom, you're doing a good job, and whatever supports we can help them. And I think finding people people who've been able to successfully find a job because maybe their partner has never let them work before it, because that's a way that they are controlling that situation. So being able to find employment or getting access to a vehicle or even their own bank account or cell phone, that they're not under, the control of their partner of, monitoring phone calls or, having access to personal funds and things like that. So I think all of those, little things that happen for people, to me, is kind of what keeps me going. Yes, we have, great success stories with some of our clients, but I strongly believe that that's their story to share and not necessarily, mine to share. So we do have some client stories within some of our publications that are online because people have given us permission to share those. So I would, that is nice. Something that people can access online too.
Yeah. And I'll just say for me, I think I kind of touched on this earlier. For me, it's really that breaking that cycle. So to see the young kids get free from that unhealthy situation and hopefully go on to have better coping skills and have healthier relationships and just making a better, kinder world, and with each individual, because with domestic violence, it can be very overwhelming, especially if you look at the news at all. almost daily, there's at least one case that makes national headlines. And that's just what we see in the media. There's so much more that we don't see. So it can be really overwhelming. So I think here at the Crisis Center, we try to focus on each individual and each family that comes to our services and just help them. And that's the best we can do. And that's making positive ripple effects throughout our community. So,
I mean, I know for me, I wouldn't be the person I am today if it wasn't for programs like yours. You know, I was in that cycle that you were talking about. And even when other things were happening to me, even outside that cycle, I didn't know that there were options. Like, oh, now I'm being treated this way at work. Well, that's normal, you know, or I'm being treated like this in this community activity or whatever. And even though it didn't feel good, I just thought, well, this is just the way life is. And it really took, you know, some intervention and wonderful organizations similar to yours that showed me that it's okay that you want more than that, or it's okay that you're not treated that way. And that it didn't just change the situation, the abuse situation, it changed my whole life. You know, like you were talking about, you know, maybe they go back to school, they get a different job. It really starts a whole other different, you know, cycle in the sense of there's this whole world I didn't know was out there because I never, not just physically couldn't see it, but I was just never exposed to it. And so once one door opened and you were talking about courage earlier, I had the courage to walk through that door. Well, that door led to all these other doors. And no, it hasn't been perfect and it wasn't, you know, but it gave me, I finally felt like I had some choices. Like I could decide where I go today, or I could decide who I'm going to call. And I know that sounds so small, but it's not when you've never been able to do that before. And so, yeah, abuse doesn't just affect your home life. It affects your school life, your community, your work, you know, it affects everything. And and I want to put it out there that this booklet you had talked about earlier, kind of these are the signs to look for. I'm going to ask Audio Information Network of Colorado if we could get a volunteer reader to read that out loud, and we'll have that as an audio file on our website. So for those who don't have access to, you know, even going on your website or access it into a different format, because we've done things like that before. And I think this would be a perfect way for AINC to, you know, bring about awareness and so that people can listen to that and have an audience.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful idea. Yeah.
There's also information there around safety planning and that type of thing. And we would be open, like if you go through that document and you're like, oh, maybe you need to think about this way, you know, particularly for serving persons who are visually impaired. If there's something that we need to be doing different or add, I mean, we are, you know, open to those suggestions and feedback too. So, you know, we want to try to make it as friendly for, like I said, all survivors, you know, and so we just, you know, that's a process, a learning process that we are always engaged in. It's like, you know, we don't have it figured out for everybody. And so how can we make sure, like we are, like you said, you know, that we are able to effectively serve everybody. So if there's ideas you have or feedback you have for us, we would welcome that as well.
Thank you so much for being willing to be on our show and talk about a topic that is hard. You know, it's hard to listen to, it's hard to talk about, but it has to happen so that, you know, those cycles can be broken and lives can be changed and on whatever level that is for those individuals. So what would, if you would both just take a moment, and what would you want what the big takeaway from today? And there, it might be different for both of you, but what would, if you wouldn't mind sharing with our audience, what would you like the takeaway be today?
Well, I think for me, I mean, the main thing is just that your audience knows that we're here and that our services are free and we're available. I think it's just really important that that we know each other exists and that we support each other because we're both supporting the community. And if somebody that's listening is in an abusive relationship right now, just know it is not your fault. If for some reason somebody hasn't believed you in the past, we believe you. And people do care about you, despite whatever you may have heard otherwise.
Thank you, Sabrina. What about you, Jody?
Nobody deserves to be treated that way or be in an abusive relationship. And I know that there's a lot of factors that play into that. And I think just, that there are people that are out there to provide support and to listen and to kind of help people navigate what that might look like for them. And there isn't a one size fit all for every person who walks through our door. So it is really, what does a person want for themselves? And we say we're on the bus with them, and they're the drivers of the bus, and we're just kind of there to help them through that journey. But it is a journey, and it can be, sometimes very overwhelming, and we realize that it will sometimes take time. And so it's not like, oh, you come in for a few times and everything is miraculously better, but it is sometimes it gets really hard, and but we are here to support people along that journey. So we're not the only resource in the metro area in Colorado. There's a lot of different agencies that provide this work. So if it's not us, then there's, it's somewhere else in Denver or in the, outlying areas of Colorado. There are supports for people available.
Thank you for that. And it is true, if you reach out, that's the big takeaway, right? Like, regardless if it's you're in a situation that you're questioning or you need support in, or if you know somebody, I think that this resource is so important for all of us, no matter what seat you have on that bus, that there are services and resources out there. It's a lot of people don't want to speak up. I mean, I've been in situations where I've heard my neighbors screaming and yelling, and I'm one of the people that does call the police, but I know that that's hard. And sometimes it's been nothing. They were literally just having an argument like so many couples do. But yet there were a couple of times where it was more than that. I think we all have to make those choices. Well, again, thank you so much for being on today and spreading the word. And I want to also thank Audio Information Network of Colorado for reaching out to you guys. And it takes a team to put this podcast on. I want to thank everybody in the background who puts this on. Thank you all for, dropping in with us week after week. Some of you have been listening from that very first podcast, and we really, really, really appreciate it. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And always remember to be kind to yourselves. Take some time to do that. And also find a way to be kind to somebody else. It's really good for your soul.